August 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The oppressive summer heat hit the men like a physical blow as they stepped off the train. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter and the other veterans of the Afrika Korps, this was the final humiliation. Defeated on the battlefield, shipped across an ocean, and now paraded under the unforgiving Texas sun, they expected the worst. Their minds, conditioned by years of propaganda, were braced for the filth, disease, and brutality they believed were standard in a decadent America. They were prepared for a prison. They were not prepared for what they were about to find. After being processed, they were marched not to lice-infested tents, but to a clean, orderly concrete building. A guard barked an order: strip and enter the showers. Richter braced himself, expecting a blast of icy, low-pressure water to complete their degradation. He reached for the simple metal knob and turned it. The shock was not electric. It was thermal, and it was absolute. A powerful, seemingly endless stream of steaming hot water hammered down on him. He stood motionless, watching as the grime and filth of the European battlefields washed away, and with it, the first layer of his ideological certainty. This simple act was an impossibility. Hot water on demand was a forgotten luxury in the bombed-out, fuel-starved cities of the Reich, a privilege reserved for the highest party elite. Yet here, in a remote camp for its enemies, America provided it as a basic standard. This wasn't just a shower. It was a demonstration of a logistical and resource capacity beyond comprehension. This is the story of how that first encounter with hot water began an education that would prove an unbelievable truth. For the soldiers of the Third Reich, this American prison camp would be a better, safer, and more civilized home than the one they had fought to defend. As the steam of the hot shower filled the small concrete room in Texas, for Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, it triggered a memory not of comfort, but of a world where such a simple luxury had become an impossible dream. His mind flashed back across the Atlantic, to the home he and his men had been fighting to defend. The Germany of 1944 was not the triumphant, glorious empire promised by propaganda. It was a civilization in the painful throes of collapse. The concept of home had been systematically dismantled, not just by enemy armies, but by the grinding, daily reality of total war. The sky itself had become the enemy. Day and night, the wail of air raid sirens was the soundtrack to civilian life, a constant harbinger of death and destruction from above. For Richter's family in Berlin, life had become a subterranean existence, spent huddled in damp, crowded cellars, listening to the thunder of Allied bomber formations overhead. They would emerge after the all-clear signal not to sunlight, but to a sky thick with smoke and the smell of burning cities. The landscape of home had become a surreal vista of pulverized buildings and mountains of rubble, where the so-called Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, worked tirelessly with their bare hands to clear the debris of what were once their neighborhoods. Survival was a desperate, daily battle against scarcity. The official food ration, when had shrunk to a grim collection of potatoes, coarse black bread, and watery soup. Meat was a distant memory. Real coffee had been replaced by ersatz brews made from roasted acorns and barley. As winter approached, the greatest fear was the cold, with coal for heating being almost non-existent. Richter thought of his parents shivering in their apartment, their reality a world away from the endless hot water he now stood in. The infrastructure of a modern nation was crumbling. Electricity was intermittent, running water was unreliable, and the basic certainties of a civilized life had vanished. This was the grim reality that stood in stark contrast to the official broadcasts from Dr. Goebbels, which still spoke of wonder weapons and imminent final victory. The German soldier was fighting for a home that, in many ways, no longer existed. It was a place of hunger, fear, and darkness. Understanding this reality is the key to understanding what came next. It is the crucial context needed to comprehend why, for Klaus Richter and thousands like him, the clean, orderly, and well-supplied American prison camp would feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Clean, but still a captive, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter was marched from the showers toward what he assumed would be the true beginning of his misery: the living quarters. His mind, steeped in the harsh realities of war, conjured images of what a prison camp should be. He pictured muddy fields surrounded by barbed wire, lice-infested tents flapping in the wind, or perhaps overcrowded cages where men were treated like animals. He steeled himself for the stench of unwashed bodies and the despair of men stripped of their dignity. This, he believed, was the universal reality of a prisoner of war. The hot shower had been a strange anomaly, a final comfort before the inevitable descent into squalor. He was about to learn that in America, even the basic standards of captivity were built upon a foundation of shocking industrial power. As his group rounded the corner of a supply building, the sight before him stopped him in his tracks. There was no muddy field. Instead, he saw what looked like a small, orderly town. A wide, clean street was lined with long, sturdy wooden buildings, arranged in perfect military precision. These were not tents or shacks. They were proper structures, built on foundations, with pitched roofs and rows of glass windows that glinted in the Texas sun. The air didn't carry the smell of decay and despair he expected. It smelled of fresh, cut pine wood and dry earth. The contrast with the world he had just left, the rubble-strewn, smoke-choked cities of Germany, was so profound, so immediate, that it felt like a hallucination. He stepped inside his assigned barracks, and the disbelief deepened. He saw neat rows of beds, each with a proper mattress and 2 thick wool blankets. In the center of the room stood a large pot-belly stove for heat. It was simple, functional, yet built with a level of quality that was staggering. He later learned the truth behind their construction. A single camp like this, designed to house several thousand prisoners, was often built from scratch in just 3 or 4 months. It was constructed using more high-quality lumber than was available for all civilian reconstruction in an entire German province for a year. This wasn't just a prison, it was a testament to a logistical and resource capacity that defied his imagination. He sat on the edge of his bed, the clean wool rough against his skin, and a devastating thought solidified in his mind. This was not a temporary cage. This was a house, better built and better heated than his own family's apartment in Berlin. The Americans, they built better homes for their enemies than the Reich could for its own people. He finally understood the meaning of total war. It wasn't about who had the fiercest soldiers, but who could build the better prison. And in that contest, Germany had already catastrophically lost. The solid, well-built barracks provided a shocking level of physical comfort, but it was the next discovery that began to attack a deeper, more fundamental part of the German psyche. For a soldier, life is stripped down to its essentials, and nothing is more essential or more grim than daily sanitation. Klaus Richter, like every man who had served on the front lines, was intimately familiar with the brutal reality of it. Crude latrine pits dug into frozen earth, the overwhelming stench of dysentery, and the constant, ever-present threat of diseases that could kill a man as surely as a bullet. He expected the American camp's facilities to be a slightly more organized version of this same filth and degradation. He was prepared for the primitive conditions of a captive. He was not prepared for a miracle of modern engineering. He was directed to a long, separate building designated as the latrine. As he pushed open the door, the first shock was not what he saw, but what he didn't see or smell. There was no filth. There was no stench. The air smelled of disinfectant and cool concrete. Before him were not trenches or buckets, but rows of gleaming white porcelain fixtures, flush toilets. Next to them, a long line of sinks, each with 2 metal faucets. He turned one, and clean, running water flowed freely. He turned the other, and to his utter disbelief, it ran hot. This was not a primitive latrine, it was a temple of hygiene, built with a level of quality and cleanliness that surpassed what was available in many civilian homes in the heart of Berlin. For men who had spent years associating sanitation with filth and disease, this clean, orderly, and effortlessly functioning system was profoundly disorienting. But the true wow factor wasn't the toilets themselves. It was the invisible infrastructure they represented. This wasn't just plumbing, this was a statement of overwhelming logistical power. To build this facility, the Americans had manufactured and transported tons of porcelain and steel into the middle of the Texas wilderness. They had laid miles of underground pipes, engineered a complex sewer system, and constructed a water purification plant capable of serving a small city, all for their captured enemies. This was a different kind of industrial, might not the loud, brute force of a bomber factory, but the quiet, sophisticated power of a nation that had waged and won a war against disease and chaos itself. It demonstrated a system that valued hygiene and human dignity so highly that it provided these advanced facilities as a basic standard, even for its prisoners. Richter stood there, the sound of flushing water echoing in the clean concrete room. A devastating thought struck him. In the Reich, propaganda preached the survival of the fittest, an ideology that embraced brutality as a natural strength. But here, in the heart of his enemy's territory, he was witnessing a different kind of fitness. It was the fitness of a society that could effortlessly build a system to protect the health of the very men it had just defeated in battle. He later wrote, "We were taught that compassion and hygiene were sentimental weaknesses in a time of total war. But what is it when your enemy's compassion is backed by engineering more powerful and efficient than your own? We were fighting a war of biology on the front lines, and losing. Here, in a prison, America was demonstrating they had already won it. This hidden side of history reveals so much. If you believe these powerful, untold stories need to be brought to light, subscribe to our channel and join a community dedicated to uncovering the truth." Having come to terms with the shocking quality of his new shelter and the miracle of modern sanitation, Klaus Richter now faced the next stage of his new routine, the camp mess hall. It was here that he expected the enemy's true nature to finally reveal itself. An army's strength is in its stomach, and the logic of war dictated that a prisoner's rations should be the bare minimum required for survival. He steeled himself for what he knew must be coming: watery cabbage soup, bread cut with sawdust, and the bitter, acorn-based ersatz coffee that had become the taste of the fatherland. He remembered the desperate hunger on the Eastern Front and the gaunt faces of his own family in his last letters from home. He was prepared for the gnawing emptiness of a prisoner's diet. He entered the long wooden building and was immediately struck by the smell. It was not the sour stench of boiling turnips he expected. It was the unmistakable, almost forgotten aroma of roasting meat and brewing coffee, real coffee. Lined up with his fellow prisoners, he watched in stunned silence as American workers in clean, white aprons piled their metal trays high. There were thick slices of roasted beef, a large scoop of creamy mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, and a slice of apple pie for dessert. For men who had subsisted on scraps and fought over stale crusts of bread, this wasn't a meal, it was a feast from a forgotten world. This wasn't a punishment. It was an invitation to a standard of living that had vanished from their own country years ago. The wow factor was not just in the quality, but in the cold, hard mathematics of nutrition. The official daily ration for each German prisoner was calculated to be between 3,300 and 4,000 calories, more than double the official ration for a healthy civilian in Berlin, and a universe away from the near-starvation levels at the front. Sugar was left in open bowls on the tables, and the coffee was real. The script of war, as Richter understood it, had been completely rewritten. This wasn't an act of kindness, it was a display of a logistical system so overwhelmingly powerful that it could afford to feed its captured enemies better than the Third Reich could feed its own victorious soldiers. Richter ate every bite of the meal, the first truly satisfying food he had tasted in years. But with every mouthful, the physical satisfaction was poisoned by a wave of crushing guilt. Each bite was a bitter reminder of his wife and parents in Germany, who were likely fantasizing about a single, mold-free potato. His diary entry that night was short and full of pain. "Today I ate like a king, and I have never felt more like a traitor. My stomach is full, but my soul is starving. How can I enjoy this feast while my family starves for the fatherland I failed to defend?" Food is such a powerful link to our past and our families. What is a specific food or meal that tells an important story from your own family's history? Share that memory with us in the comments below. Having rationalized America's economic conflicts as a flaw, Klaus Richter now turned his analytical mind to the source of all power, the national leadership. He sought out newspapers known for their opposition to the Roosevelt administration, determined to understand the limits of this supposed American freedom. He was about to confront a reality so alien to his worldview, it would shatter his final intellectual defense. He found editorials that didn't just question Roosevelt's policies but attacked the man himself, calling him a dictator and a warmonger. He saw political cartoons depicting the American president as an authoritarian, just like his own Führer. For Richter, who had sworn a blood oath of personal loyalty to Hitler, this was incomprehensible. In Germany, the Führerprinzip meant the leader's will was the nation's will. To criticize the Führer was to attack Germany's soul. Here, attacking the president was a national pastime, exercised with brutal enthusiasm by his political opponents, even as soldiers died overseas under his command. This wasn't just dissent. It was, in his eyes, a nation gleefully committing ideological suicide. But the most devastating revelation was learning that America would hold a fully contested presidential election in November 1944. The concept was staggering. In the middle of the greatest war in human history, the American people could vote to fire their commander-in-chief. Roosevelt would have to pause from directing global strategy to campaign against a rival, Thomas Dewey, who would publicly declare that the president was incompetent and that he could win the war better. For Richter, who knew only the staged 99% approval referendums for his own leader, this democratic process was the very definition of national suicide. It was a level of internal conflict that, according to everything he had been taught, should have guaranteed a swift and total collapse. That evening his prior conclusions vanished. He now saw that the strikes and local arguments he had dismissed as chaos were not random acts. They were symptoms of a system built on the very principle of conflict. He realized with a chilling certainty that the unity he prized so highly was a brittle facade, enforced by fear, while the Americans derived an impossible strength from the chaos itself. His diary entry reflected his final, terrifying conclusion. "We are not fighting a nation. We are fighting an idea that we cannot comprehend. An idea that feeds on disagreement and grows stronger from internal conflict. By every law of logic, they should have already collapsed. The fact that they have not, the fact that they are conquering the world, means our entire foundation is a lie. We have already lost." Having seen his beliefs in political and economic unity shattered, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter now examined America through the last and most sacred lens of his Nazi worldview, the ideology of racial purity. For his entire life, he had been taught that a nation's strength was a direct product of its racial homogeneity. Goebbels' propaganda had relentlessly insisted that America, a mongrel nation of mixed races, was inherently degenerate, chaotic, and biologically incapable of greatness. Now, seeking to make sense of the chaos he had witnessed, Richter began to search the American newspapers for evidence of this racial rot, certain that here, at last, he would find the ultimate proof of America's inherent weakness. At first, what he found seemed to confirm everything he had been taught. He read shocking reports about the rigid system of Jim Crow segregation in the southern states, where black Americans were legally treated as second-class citizens. He read about lynchings, about simmering racial tensions in northern industrial cities, and about the violent race riot that had erupted in Detroit in 1943, a conflict that required federal troops to restore order. From Richter's perspective, this was the ultimate validation of his beliefs. The propaganda was true. This nation was not unified. It was a society at war with itself, torn apart by the very racial impurity that the Third Reich sought to eliminate. To his mind, a nation so internally fractured along racial lines could never triumph. This, he thought, was the fatal weakness that would inevitably lead to America's collapse. But as he read further, he stumbled upon the most profound and destabilizing paradox of all. Alongside the articles detailing the horrors of racism, he found editorials and columns from American citizens, both black and white, fiercely condemning it. He learned of a movement within the African American community called the Double V Campaign, a patriotic call for a double victory: victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. He read the words of black leaders demanding that America live up to its own creed that all men are created equal. The ultimate shock for Richter was not the existence of racism in America. The shock was the existence of a loud, vibrant, and patriotic anti-racist movement that was openly challenging the nation's conscience in the middle of a global war. In Germany, such a discussion would be silenced with a bullet. Here, it was printed on the front pages. That realization was the final, devastating blow. The entire Nazi ideology was built on the foundational lie that racial purity was the source of national strength, but the evidence in front of him was irrefutable. Here was America, the most racially diverse and conflicted nation on earth, and it was simultaneously producing a level of industrial and military power that was crushing the racially pure Aryan Reich. The theory was not just wrong, it was a catastrophic fantasy. The central pillar of his worldview had been utterly pulverized by the chaotic, contradictory, and brutally honest pages of a free American newspaper. With his core beliefs about politics, economics, and race now reduced to rubble, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter clung to the last sanctuary of his pride, the professional honor and supposed infallibility of the German military. He had been raised on the myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility, a narrative meticulously crafted by Goebbels, where defeats were state secrets and setbacks were spun into tales of heroic, strategic withdrawals. Every German newspaper presented a flawless image of the High Command's genius. Richter now turned his full attention to the American paper's war coverage, expecting to finally find the familiar, boastful language of state propaganda, a narrative that would surely mirror his own nation's. What he discovered was a truth so stark and so contrary to his training that it felt like a betrayal of the very concept of warfare. The American press did not hide its military failures, it reported on them. He read detailed, often critical analyses of Allied campaigns. He found articles describing the brutal early days of the war, like the humiliating American defeat at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in 1943. The reports didn't just mention the loss, they detailed the tactical blunders, the equipment failures, and the heavy price paid by inexperienced American troops against his veteran Afrika Korps. He saw maps that didn't just show arrows of triumphant advance, but also highlighted areas of stalemate and retreat, presenting the war not as a glorious crusade, but as a bloody, difficult, and often mismanaged struggle. But the most shocking discovery was the concept of public accountability. He didn't just read about the failures, he read about their consequences. He learned that the American general responsible for the Kasserine Pass disaster had been swiftly relieved of command, his failure becoming a topic of open debate in newspapers across the country. He saw local papers publish long, somber lists of their hometown boys who were killed or missing in action, sharing the human cost of the war with a devastating honesty. In Germany, a failing general was quietly reassigned, and casualty numbers were a closely guarded state secret. Here, military failure was not hidden. It was a matter of national debate, a painful lesson to be learned in the public square. Richter finally understood the fundamental difference between the two war machines. The German war machine was a rigid, brittle structure, built on the lie of its own perfection. It demanded belief, and a single crack could shatter the entire facade. The American war machine, however, was a learning system. It was built on the painful but powerful process of openly admitting its mistakes, studying its failures, and adapting. This brutal honesty forged a bond of trust between the government, its soldiers, and its people, a bond far stronger than the fear-based loyalty of the Reich. That night, Richter wrote a final, simple truth in his diary. Our strength is a lie we tell ourselves to keep from falling. Their strength is the truth they tell themselves to keep from failing. We are brittle, they are resilient. I now understand we were defeated long before the first shot was fired. After accepting the painful truth about his government's military failures, Klaus Richter clung to one final belief, the unbreakable unity of the German soldier. He believed all true Germans were bound by a sacred loyalty to the Führer and the fatherland. That belief was about to be shattered. One afternoon in the camp library, he found a new publication. It wasn't American, it was written in perfect, intellectual German. It was a newspaper published by German prisoners, for German prisoners. He had discovered Der Ruf, the call. This was no simple camp newsletter, but a high-level political journal filled with sophisticated essays. Richter read, in stunned disbelief, articles that openly discussed German collective guilt for the crimes of the regime. The paper didn't argue for an American victory. It argued for the soul of Germany itself, calling on prisoners to reject the ideology that had led them to ruin and to imagine a new, democratic, post-Nazi nation. This was not the voice of the American enemy, It was the voice of a German intellectual rebellion happening right inside the barbed wire. This was no accident. De Roof was the cornerstone of a sophisticated American program to identify and empower anti-Nazi prisoners. Its editors, men like Alfred Anders, were not traitors, but respected soldiers and intellectuals. The Americans understood a crucial psychological truth. The message of democracy is most powerful when it comes not from a foreign guard, but from a fellow countryman. For Richter, the realization that his enemy understood his own people's psychology so well was a profound and humiliating shock. That night, his diary entry was one of personal anguish. These writers were his kameraden. They had worn the same uniform and bled for the same flag. His first instinct was rage to brand them as traitors who had sold their souls for American comforts. But he could not dismiss their powerful logical arguments. Their undeniable German identity and their clear love for a Germany beyond the Reich forced him to confront his own definition of loyalty. He was left with a final, agonizing question that tore at his soul. Who is the real traitor? The soldier who sees the truth of our nation's crimes and speaks it, or the soldier, like me, who continues to fight for the lie? The discovery of dissent among his own countrymen was a wound to Klaus Richter's soul, leaving him to question the very meaning of loyalty. In this state of confusion, he turned to the one connection he had left to his old world, a letter to his wife in Berlin. In the Wehrmacht, writing home was a duty. Letters were expected to be confident and full of fighting spirit, small pieces of propaganda to boost morale. Richter expected the Americans to enforce a similar policy. He sat with the blank page before him, but a formidable censor stood in his way, the dangerous truth he now carried. The American mail censorship operation was another system of staggering scale. At secret facilities like P.O. Box 1000, 142 inches Virginia, thousands of personnel, many of them German-born refugees, read and analyzed millions of letters from prisoners. Their primary goal was not to enforce ideological purity, but to gather military intelligence. This army of censors read tales of love and despair, but the great irony for prisoners like Richter was that the American censor was the least of their worries. The true prison was the reality of the world they had left behind. How could he begin to describe his new reality? If he wrote about the camp library with its uncensored books, his wife would think he was losing his mind or sending a coded message. If he described the camp meals, with their daily rations of meat and milk, it would be an act of unimaginable cruelty to a family living on watery soup in a bombed-out city. He came to a horrifying realization. Telling the truth would actively endanger his family. Every piece of mail arriving in Germany was scrutinized by the Gestapo. A letter that even hinted at American prosperity could be seen as treason, leading to his family's arrest. So, he wrote a lie. He dipped his pen and wrote the same empty pleasantries he had been taught to write for years. He wrote that his morale was high and his faith in the final victory was unshaken. He wrote the words of a loyal officer, even as the beliefs behind them had turned to ash. He sealed the envelope, feeling a sense of profound and crushing isolation. The barbed wire of the camp kept his body in America, but the truth he now knew had erected a far more painful wall between him and the woman he loved. That night, his diary captured his despair. Today I wrote to my wife. I told her I was well. I did not tell her I am a ghost, trapped between a world that is a lie and another I can never truly be a part of. The true prison is the truth I could not write. Richter, now adrift in a sea of broken beliefs, tried to find the logic in his transformation. The access to libraries, the uncensored newspapers, the anti-Nazi publications, were these just random acts of a chaotic system, or was there a hidden design at play? He began to suspect that the most effective prison was one the captive didn't even know he was in. The truth, when he finally discovered it, was more sophisticated and brilliant than he could have ever imagined. He and the other prisoners were, in fact, subjects of an ambitious psychological warfare program. The events that seemed random were carefully orchestrated components of a secret American strategy run by the Provost Marshal General's office, specifically its Special Projects Division. This was not a crude brainwashing program. Its goal was far more ambitious, the re-education of the German mind to prepare a new generation of leaders for a future democratic Germany. The libraries, the uncensored news, and the quiet support for publications like Der Ruf were all calculated moves in this grand intellectual chess game. The most shocking wow factor of this secret program was not the plan itself, but the architects behind it. The strategy was designed and often implemented by a group the Third Reich had foolishly exiled: German, American academics and social scientists, many of them German Jews who had fled Hitler's regime. These intellectual giants were now using their intimate understanding of the German psyche to systematically dismantle the Nazi mind from across the ocean. The very minds the Nazis had deemed inferior and sought to exterminate were now the architects of their ideological defeat. Their weapon was not crude propaganda, but sophisticated social psychology. They understood that the most effective way to change a mind was not to force-feed it new ideas, but to give it the tools to deconstruct its own lies. When Richter finally learned of this program, his transformation was complete. The confusion was replaced by a profound, almost respectful awe. He realized he and his comrades had been fighting a war of tanks and planes, while the Americans were fighting a second, invisible war for their very minds. He was never just a prisoner of war. He was a student in a vast, invisible classroom, and the lesson was the failure of his entire worldview. His diary entry that night reflected this final checkmate. Today I learned the truth. Nothing here is an accident. They have been studying us, understanding us, and patiently guiding us toward a new way of thinking. They are not just trying to defeat our army, they are trying to cure our nation's soul. This is a level of strategic thinking we never imagined. This is how a true superpower wages war. By the winter of 1943, the relentless assault of American reality had achieved its goal. The atmosphere within the prisoner of war camps had fundamentally changed. The loud, arrogant debates in the mess halls about German superiority, which had characterized the first months of captivity, had faded into a somber, questioning silence. It was a silence filled not with the discipline of soldiers, but with the heavy weight of collective doubt. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter observed that even the most fanatical Nazi officers in his barracks no longer spoke of final victory. They had stopped defending the indefensible. The constant, undeniable evidence of America's political freedoms, its economic strength, its complex social fabric, and its transparent military operations had acted like a slow, corrosive acid, dissolving the iron certainty of their ideology. They had, as one American intelligence officer noted in a report, simply seen too much. This widespread phenomenon was identified and given a name by the American sociologists and psychologists of the Special Projects Division: ideological collapse syndrome. It was the complete and often painful disintegration of a person's core belief system when confronted with an overwhelming avalanche of contradictory truths. For the German POWs, the world as they knew it had been systematically deconstructed, lie by lie. The propaganda that had once seemed like a shield now felt like a cage of ignorance from which they had just been released. This syndrome wasn't a failure of their spirit as soldiers, but a failure of the very ideas they had been sent to fight for. It was the logical conclusion of a worldview built on lies coming into contact with a reality built on a foundation of chaotic, uncomfortable but undeniable truth. The symptoms of this collapse were clear across the camp system. Prisoners who had once burned American magazines out of defiance were now the first in line at the camp library, reading with a desperate, quiet intensity. They were actively requesting access to the very newspapers they had previously dismissed as Jewish-controlled propaganda. There was an insatiable thirst for knowledge, for any piece of information that might help them make sense of their shattered reality. They were no longer fighting the information, they were consuming it, trying to piece together the wreckage of their old world and understand the full scale of the lies they had been told. They had ceased to be defiant warriors. They had become somber students of their own downfall. Richter saw this transformation in himself. The anger and contempt had vanished, replaced by a quiet, mournful clarity. He looked at the faces of his fellow prisoners and no longer saw soldiers of a master race, but a generation of lost men, betrayed by the leaders they had sworn to die for. His diary was no longer filled with observations about America's strangeness, but with agonizing questions about Germany's future. The old world, with its simple certainties and glorious lies, was dead. The ideological demolition was complete. The ground had been cleared, but the future was a terrifying, empty space. For Richter and thousands like him, the final and most important question remained. After the fall of the Reich, what would rise from the ashes? The collapse of their old world had left Klaus Richter and thousands of his fellow prisoners in a state of quiet, intellectual limbo. They had been stripped of their political, economic, and racial certainties, and were now grappling with the terrifying freedom of thought. They had learned, through a painful deconstruction, to trust the chaotic but honest voice of the American press. They were now receptive to the truth, no matter how unsettling, but they were completely unprepared for the final, soul-shattering truth that was about to be revealed, a truth so monstrous it would make all their previous shocks about industry and ideology seem trivial. In April 1945, as Allied forces pushed deep into the heart of Germany, a new set of names began to appear in the camp newspapers, names that would be forever burned into the conscience of humanity: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The articles were accompanied by photographs, images so horrific, so profoundly evil, that the prisoners' first unified reaction was instinctive denial. Atrocity propaganda, the men shouted in the barracks. A final, desperate lie to break our spirit. For weeks, this was the consensus. It had to be a trick, a cynical psychological operation. After all, they were soldiers of the honorable Wehrmacht. They had fought for the fatherland. They reasoned that no nation, not even one as ruthless as their leaders professed to be, was capable of such organized industrial-scale murder. This was the last line of defense for their sanity and their honor. But then, the evidence became an inescapable flood. The camp authorities began showing them the official newsreel footage, the same films being shown to horrified civilians in America and Britain. They saw it with their own eyes. The skeletal survivors with hollow eyes, the walking dead, the mountains of emaciated corpses being bulldozed into mass graves by grim-faced American soldiers. The moving images were undeniable, a silent testament to a crime beyond words. Then came the final confirmation, the one they could not refute. Letters from their own families in Germany. In hushed, terrified tones, their wives and parents wrote about the unbelievable things being discovered in camps just miles from their homes. The wall of denial shattered, replaced by a silence born of absolute, soul-crushing horror. This was not a military defeat or an ideological disagreement. It was a moral collapse. The last shred of pride they held the honor of the German soldier was obliterated. They were not just soldiers on the losing side of a war. They were the unwitting accomplices and armed guards of a criminal regime engaged in the greatest crime in human history. They were forced to confront the fact that the gas chambers and the ovens were just as much a part of the German war machine as the Panzers and Stukas. That night, Richter wrote a final, tear-stained entry. We thought we were warriors. We discovered we were the watchmen for a slaughterhouse. All this time we were shocked by America's strength. Today, we are shocked by Germany's evil. The war is not just lost, our honor is lost with it. We are not just defeated, we are shamed before God and history. The collapse of their old world had left Klaus Richter and thousands of his fellow prisoners in a state of quiet, intellectual limbo. They had been stripped of their political, economic, and racial certainties, grappling with the terrifying freedom of thought. They had learned, through a painful deconstruction, to trust the chaotic but honest voice of the American press. They were now receptive to the truth, no matter how unsettling. But they were completely unprepared for the final, soul-shattering revelation that was about to unfold, a truth so monstrous it would make all their previous shocks about American industry and ideology seem utterly trivial. In April 1945, as Allied forces pushed deep into the heart of Germany, a new set of names began to appear in the camp newspapers, names that would be forever burned into the conscience of humanity: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The articles were accompanied by photographs, images so horrific, so profoundly evil, that the prisoners' first unified reaction was instinctive, vehement denial. Atrocity propaganda. The men roared in the barracks, their voices laced with desperate fury. A final, desperate lie to break our spirit. For weeks, this was the consensus. It had to be a trick, a cynical psychological operation. After all, They were soldiers of the honorable Wehrmacht. They had fought for the fatherland, not for monsters. They reasoned that no nation, not even one as ruthless as their leaders professed to be, was capable of such organized, industrial-scale murder. This was the last, desperate line of defense for their sanity and their honor, a barrier against an unthinkable reality. But then, the evidence became an inescapable, overwhelming flood. The camp authorities began showing them the official newsreel footage, the very same films being shown to horrified civilians in America and Britain. They saw it with their own eyes, the skeletal survivors with hollow, haunted eyes, the walking dead stumbling through barren landscapes. They saw the vast, incomprehensible mountains of emaciated corpses being bulldozed into mass graves by grim-faced American soldiers, whose own faces betrayed a profound, nauseated disbelief. The moving images were undeniable, a silent, sickening testament to a crime beyond words. Then came the final, crushing confirmation, the one they could not refute, letters from their own families in Germany. In hushed, terrified tones, their wives and parents wrote about the unbelievable things being discovered in camps just miles from their homes, camps they had walked past, lived near, and never truly seen. The wall of denial shattered, replaced by a silence born of absolute soul-crushing horror. This was not a military defeat or an ideological disagreement. It was a moral collapse. The last shred of pride they held the honor of the German soldier was obliterated. They were not just soldiers on the losing side of a war. They were the unwitting accomplices and armed guards of a criminal regime engaged in the greatest crime in human history. They were forced to confront the fact that the gas chambers and the ovens were just as much a part of the German war machine as the panzers and Stukas, operating under the same flag. That night, Richter wrote a final, tear-stained entry in his diary. "We thought we were warriors. We discovered we were the watchmen for a slaughterhouse. All this time we were shocked by America's strength. Today we are shocked by Germany's evil. The war is not just lost, our honor is lost with it. We are not just defeated, we are shamed before God and history, and the camps were home." The revelation of the Holocaust was the final, agonizing death of the old Germany. For Klaus Richter and the hundreds of thousands of his countrymen in American captivity, all that remained was the profound shame of their service and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. Between 1945 and 1946, they were repatriated, sent back across the Atlantic. They returned to a nation that existed only as a ghost, a landscape of rubble, ruin, and starvation, a country divided and occupied by the very powers they had been told were inferior. But these were not the same men who had left Africa in chains 2 years earlier. They were physically healthier than the civilians they returned to, yet their minds bore the deep scars of a shattered worldview. They were returning to a broken homeland, but they carried with them something precious and entirely unexpected, the blueprint for its rebirth. They became America's unwitting ambassadors of democracy, the most effective agents of transformation in post-war Germany. When they spoke of a different way, their countrymen listened. They were not foreign occupiers imposing a new system. They were sons, brothers, and husbands who had seen the other side with their own eyes. They had witnessed the awesome power of a free press and the strength of a nation that was not afraid to criticize itself. They understood that America's true might came not from a single dictatorial will, but from the chaotic, creative energy of millions of free people pursuing prosperity. They had seen a future that worked, and they were now determined to build it from the ashes of their past, piece by painful piece. Many of these former prisoners rose to prominence in West Germany's reconstruction, becoming the very architects of the new democratic state. Walter Holstein, who had organized and taught law classes to his fellow prisoners at Camp Como, Mississippi, became the first president of the European Commission, a key founder of European unity. Hans Kroll, a prisoner at Camp Shelby, was appointed as West Germany's ambassador to the United States, tasked with rebuilding the crucial bridge between the two former enemies. Thousands of others, whose names are lost to history, became captains of industry, champions of agricultural reform, and founders of new, independent newspapers, each applying the practical and philosophical lessons they had learned in American captivity. They were the seeds of a new Germany, planted in the unlikely soil of American prison camps. They championed a free press, knowing its power to hold leaders accountable. They built a consumer economy, having witnessed its ability to create stability and wealth for all, not just the elite. The German Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that saw West Germany rise from the rubble to become an economic superpower in the 1950 seconds, was built in part on the lessons learned in the United States. As Hans Kroll would later write in his memoirs, "We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. We saw that democracy created wealth." These lessons, learned as prisoners, shaped the new Germany. The journey of Oberleutnant Klaus Richter and the thousands of prisoners like him was a passage through the looking glass. They had arrived in America as soldiers of a regime that had perfected the art of the lie, convinced of their own ideological superiority, and expecting to find a nation weakened by its chaotic freedoms. They left as witnesses to a profound and unsettling truth, that the very things their Nazi ideology had labeled as fatal weaknesses, a free press, political dissent, economic arguments, and open self-criticism were, in fact, the messy, resilient, and undeniable sources of America's true power. They had been sent to conquer a nation, but had instead been conquered by an idea so foreign to their own worldview that it systematically dismantled every belief they held dear. The Third Reich was a monument of steel built on a foundation of sand. It demanded absolute, silent unity, but this unity was brittle, enforced by the terror of the Gestapo and the relentless propaganda of Goebbels. It projected an image of perfect, unwavering strength, but it was a strength that could not withstand the slightest crack of doubt or the faintest whisper of dissent. The Nazi system, by silencing all criticism, had made itself blind. It was incapable of adapting, incapable of learning from its mistakes, and ultimately incapable of seeing the world as it truly was. It was a system perfectly designed to dominate a world of simple, brutal force, but it was catastrophically unprepared for an enemy whose greatest strength was not its uniformity, but its complexity. America, they discovered, was the opposite. It was not a perfect monument, but a raging, chaotic storm of competing ideas and conflicting truths. It was a nation that put its flaws on the front page for all to see, a nation that argued with itself in the midst of a total war. It was a society strong enough to not only tolerate dissent but to see it as a vital, life-giving part of its existence. The Germans had believed that a nation at war with itself could not possibly win a war against others. They were wrong. They learned that a nation that constantly wrestled with its own conscience, that openly debated its failures and shortcomings, was infinitely more resilient than one that had silenced its own people into a fragile, artificial unity. The ultimate secret weapon in America's arsenal was never a tank, a plane, or even the atomic bomb. It was the First Amendment. It was the messy, inefficient, but unbreakable power of a free society to self-correct. The most powerful form of propaganda, they learned, was no propaganda at all, just the raw, uncensored, and often ugly truth. The lies that had so shocked Klaus Richter in the American newspapers, the criticism of the president, the reports of strikes, the admission of military setbacks were, in the end, the ultimate proof of a nation's confidence. They had learned that the most dangerous lies were not the ones they were allowed to read in the American newspapers, but the ones they had been forced to believe their entire lives. The journey of the German POWs was a passage through the looking glass. They arrived as soldiers of a regime that demanded blind faith in a single perfect truth, only to be confronted by a nation that drew its strength not from perfection, but from its chaotic, open, and honest embrace of its own flaws. They learned that the ultimate secret weapon in a nation's arsenal is not propaganda, but the freedom to confront uncomfortable truths. In the end, the most dangerous lies were not the ones they were allowed to read in the American newspapers, but the ones they had been forced to believe their entire lives. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the hidden psychological battles behind history's most pivotal events. The story you've just seen is one of many. Every week, we explore another forgotten chapter, another secret that changes the way you see the world. If you believe, as we do, that understanding the past is the key to understanding ourselves, then you belong here. Don't miss the next investigation. To become part of this community of truth seekers and ensure you never miss a story, Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications. The next chapter of history is waiting.